This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here he is, the host of the podcast, AWR Hawkins.
Welcome to Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart news podcast focused on guns, gun rights, the Second Amendment. We always sum those things up here under the banner of freedom, always have, always will. And that's because an armed citizen is a free citizen. Folks, I'm going to do something a little unorthodox this week. We're going to cover just a bit of news, and then we're going to shift to my Hillsdale College presentation. And that's because that presentation is right in the wheelhouse for listeners for Bullets. So I think you're going to enjoy it. Or at least I hope that there'll be things in it that help explain and bolster your positions as pro-gun Americans, pro-Second Amendment Americans. Folks, we had a representative from California, a Democrat, really make a weird statement. I believe over the weekend, Representative Eric Swalwell got in an exchange with Joe Biggs. Joe Biggs is a reporter. I know he's affiliated with InfoWars. I don't know what other outlets. So I don't know, I don't know the expanse of his reporting. I'll put it that way, but or the breadth of his reporting. But either way, he gets in this exchange with Swalwell, and Swalwell's saying that he's going to confiscate assault weapons, and Joe Biggs is saying, if you do that, if you try to do that, you're going to cause a war. And Swalwell says, and this is a paraphrase, but it'll be a short war, my friend, because the U.S. government has nukes. Did you feel that? Even when I said it, you went, ooh. Because what Swalwell was suggesting is exactly what you heard. He was suggesting that, there will be, the U.S. government can go to the use of nukes against gun owners if said gun owners don't hand over their weapons. Now, this Swalwell guy is the same guy who in May told Tucker Carlson that he wants to do a buyback plan for AR-15s, but it's not going to be a forced buyback. Instead, you can either do the buyback or face criminal prosecution. It's the same thing. It's a forced buyback. It's confiscation. Now, Swalwell, you think, why are Swalwell's views that important? They're important because he has his eye on running for president in 2020. This is a guy who believes talking about confiscating guns is mainstream talk. That's what he thinks. That's what he thinks. Now, he's come out. He faced so much blowback over this. He has come out and said he was just being sarcastic. He really doesn't want to use nukes on gun owners. He was just funning you. He was just kidding. All right? Well, I don't know. It's kind of weird that you would choose to kid about that. So I'm not so sure. I don't trust Swalwell. I don't trust him at all because he's demonstrated an animosity for the Second Amendment, zero respect for the right to keep and bear arms. And here's the thing that's funny about him. He's on this kick, and it's really been post-borderline bar and grill attack, which was November 7th. He's on this kick about confiscating quote-unquote assault weapons. Was an assault weapon used at the borderline bar and grill? No. A handgun was. Now you think about this. If an assault weapons ban were passed, and the next week someone used a handgun to kill 12 people at a borderline bar and grill, as they did in California, what would the Democrats immediately do? Oh, we didn't ban enough. We need to ban also semi-automatic handguns. So you see what I'm saying, folk? You see what I'm saying? You cannot let the camel get his nose in the tent here. You just can't. You have to oppose Swalwell and his plans for an assault weapons ban, and especially assault weapons confiscation. You got to oppose them tooth and nail. You just do. And let him blither and blather about using nukes on gun owners. Let him do it all he wants. In the end, it makes him look like the fool. And it also demonstrates the fact that the left, as I always say, they lack the capacity for rational thought, period. Folks, I did a presentation at Hillsdale College. I know I did a short kind of teaser on that in last week's podcast, and I read just a bit of the speech, but I have it recorded, and so we're going to start here and go through and just do the next few segments of this podcast with clips of that speech. And it's because so many of the things we've discussed on this podcast, they all came together right there in those few moments at Hillsdale. And so we're going to begin it here, and then the next segment will pick up and play a little more, and then the third segment will pick up and play a little more. But I want to give a shout out to Terry and Doug before I start. And I called him Doug. His official name is Douglas. But Terry and Doug, they flew over. They flew in from another state to see me at Hillsdale, and it was a great surprise. And their tie to me and my tie to them is this podcast. And they had heard me mention on the podcast that I was speaking at Hillsdale, and they came over and attended the event. It was a great time. And after my speech, we went back to the reception area, and we stood around a table there and visited and talked about red flag laws and how those laws are absolutely impotent to stop bad guys. We talked about other gun controls and the fact that those gun controls do not stop bad people. They only keep good people from being armed. So it was a great conversation. Thanks, Terry and Doug, for coming over. It was great to meet you, and I hope I get the chance to meet some other folks who listen to this podcast from time to time. So with that said, let's begin. This is my presentation at Hillsdale College. The title of the lecture was The Human Cost of Gun Control.
I enjoyed listening to Brad yesterday. He opened us up and he talked about utopia, regulation, and it's important. I told him when he came down, it's funny how everything overlaps when you focus on the truth, because I'm going to talk about utopia as well. I enjoyed listening to Stephen Moore talk about regulation, and particularly Trump's war on regulation. I thought that was great. What I've been asked to speak on is regulation as it pertains to gun control, and particularly the human cost of gun control. This was a give me when Matt reached out to me and asked me if I'd do this, because it's basically what I write every day at Breitbart. Even though I don't title the stories "The Human Cost of Gun Control," it's what I cover. And so I'm glad to be here to do that with you. I like to state up front what I'm going to do. I think it makes it easier to track with me, and it's just beneficial in that way. I'm going to cover the human cost of gun control from two angles. One will just blend into the other. The first angle is the existential cost. The second angle is the practical cost. And when I say the existential cost, what I mean is before gun control kills us, and it does kill us, before it kills us, it makes our humanity suffer. Gun control is inhumane at its core, and in that way it is an existential threat. And I begin on that angle, and I will end on the practical angle where we look at cold, hard numbers, and we see that once we suffer, we die thanks to gun control, okay? So that's how I will approach this. The left, again, to echo Brad's words, the left promises us a utopia. Heaven on earth, paradise on earth, if we will exchange the recklessness of freedom for the security of government intervention and protection. In other words, they claim to offer us smooth sailing, a snag-free life, a snag-free existence where the sharp corners have been filed down, if not removed altogether. And we receive this utopian blessing by doing one thing, giving up our self-determination by degrees. As I hope you know, the left's promises are illusory. Tens of millions of Americans, and maybe many, 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 many times that number, have given up their freedom for government security. And what did they get? In the end, they realized they traded independence for dependence. They traded liberty for enslavement. All right? You see, the lure of leftism is the presentation of an alternative reality, one in which enduring norms and a mental paradigm based on the metaphysical are exchanged in whole or in part for a life that can be fine-tuned, where morals are subjective to each individual. And this fine-tuning happens by a bureaucrat or a team of bureaucrats in a city far away, or by an academician, or by an establishment media talking head, or by a very charismatic politician whose desires run 180 degrees counter to what our founding fathers would desire. This is the world in which we live. And it is in large part a battle between reality and fantasy, between those who conform themselves to the objective and those who tell us the objective will conform itself to us, right? The latter, most often, those who tell us the objective will conform itself to us, most often they do that because they're seeking power. You need to understand that. The late Charlton Heston, he saw this happening in the 1990s. And I look at it, the guests, you all remember this happening. I'm old enough to remember this happening in the 1990s. You saw the divide where people tried to take the objective and somehow make it subjective, to conform it to us, to change the norms, if not dismiss the norms. There was a culture war going on. That was a popular phrase then that we don't use a lot now, but it was a popular phrase then. And in the year 2000, Charlton Heston wrote, "We are once again engaged in a great civil war, but this time it's not a war that divides us north from south or black from white. Rather, it's a cultural war, and to lose it is to be stripped of our most basic birthright." In other words, if we lose this fight against those who believe that they can make the objective conform to them, if we lose this fight, we lose our freedom. That's what Heston is saying, all right? Now, it is important to note that when government officials promise us utopia, they don't always do so directly. Instead, they promise it via regulations. They advertise those as saving the planet, right? Or bringing equality or equity to the quote-unquote unequal distribution of wealth, or making us safe in our workplaces, schools, churches, etc. And one of their favorite regulations is gun control. They use gun control to promise us safety. If only we'll adopt this gun control or that gun control, we will be safe. Government will make sure we are safe. But as with all other aspects of the government's promises, in order to enjoy this safety, this utopia, we have to give up something. We have to give up something to receive the blessings gun controllers promise. Think about it this way. In gun-free zones, we give up our ability to bear arms for self-defense. In place of arms, we learn to suppress any concern, and we ignore the danger of defenselessness by convincing ourselves that everyone will obey that gun-free zone. Everyone will obey the sign that says no guns allowed. But reality is harder to tame than the left said. Reality is harder to remold than Nancy Pelosi told me. And on a sunny day in April 2007, the newsman comes on, and what's he say? 32 people are dead and many more are wounded in a gun-free zone in Virginia Tech. And we're in shock because the left told us that wouldn't happen. But we rein in our shock. We gather ourselves, we go back to our gun-free churches, workplaces, schools, streets, and then what happens? Then we get a call. Not a call, excuse me. We see the newsman again, and he says 12 are dead. 12 in a gun-free theater in Aurora, Colorado. And we're more shocked this time than we were the first time. We haven't learned our lesson. But what do? We rein it in again. We pull ourselves in. We sit in our gun-free churches and schools again. And what happens? The newsman comes on. 26 are dead in the gun-free zone at Sandy Hook. What do? We fluff up our alternative reality like a pillow. And we go right back to our gun-free zones. We go right back to believing that this alternative reality will work. And then the newsman comes on and says 49 were killed in a gun-free zone at Orlando Pulse. And he's quickly followed by a newsman that says 26 were killed in a church that was gun-free in Sutherland Springs, Texas. And so the narrative continues. and we realize reality refuses to be tamed. We pay an existential price again and again and again for trusting in the left's promise of utopia, particularly for trusting it by embracing regulations that are gun control at their essence. And this brings me to a crucial point. Probably going to be the best point I'm going to make this whole time because it's very simple, but it's profound. Gun control is not a suitable substitute for freedom. It's not. And when you sit in a gun-free zone, you may be doing it involuntarily. You may be doing it subconsciously. But when you sit in a gun-free zone and a large crowd of people and they're congregated together and there are many ways into that building and many ways out, you're inviting an attack. You've put yourself in a defenseless position. That scenario is not a suitable substitute for freedom. That's what I'm saying. If it were, the things our founders treasured, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those things would flourish where gun control is strongest. They would, but they don't. Instead, life ends in violence, liberty wanes, and happiness gets lost in calls to shelter in place. Doesn't work. Just doesn't work. Now we have to understand something. Freedom is paramount. We were born to be free and our hearts yearn to be free. They do. And because we were created with this yearning, it's of a higher order. You know what I'm saying. It can't be satisfied with a man-made substitute. It just can't. For this reason, the attempts to hedge in or hedge off certain zones that are gun-free often end in death, as I've just illustrated. For such zones and such controls place man in the unnatural position of defenselessness. I hate that phrase because I hate the truth it represents, but I love that phrase because I love the truth it communicates. Gun-free zones, the controls they represent, put us in the unnatural state of defenselessness. It's not natural. When we're in a place where our God-given rights are restricted, we're in a place that is not natural. That is what I'm saying. Our Supreme Court recognizes that the central point of the Second Amendment, the central point, it's not keeping and bearing arms, although that's very close, but it's self-defense. Self-defense is the why behind keep and bear arms. That's why we bear arms. When the Supreme Court ruled in McDonald v. Chicago, that's 2010, Sam Alito wrote the majority opinion, and here's what he said. Self-defense is a basic right recognized by many legal systems from ancient times to the present day, and in Heller we held that individual self-defense is, quote, the central component of the Second Amendment right, unquote. Think of self-defense as the hinge. Think of the right to keep and bear arms as the door. And the door swings on that hinge, the right to self-defense. And this is an aside, but when a state or a city says to you, oh, we love the Second Amendment, we don't have any problem with you owning a gun, but they won't let you take it out for self-defense, or they think the only reason you should own the gun is to trap shoot, they have no understanding of the Second Amendment, because the central component is that you have that gun with you to defend your most valuable possession, which is not your purse or your rings or your necklace or your car, it's your life. This is what our founders believed. This is what the court has affirmed. And what this means is self-defense is one of those rights with which we were endowed by our Creator. Think about this. When the right is honored, humanity is intact. When it is constricted via regulation after regulation, our humanity suffers. And I can't say enough, we suffer before we die. In other words, it gets worse than suffering, but we suffer at the very start. Philosophers, men of state, and founders of country have made this clear, not over the decades, but over the centuries. Aristotle wrote this, when farmers have no arms, the workers have neither land nor arms. This makes them virtually the servants of those who do have arms. In these circumstances, the equal sharing of offices and honors becomes an impossibility. Montesquieu said, who does not see that self-defense is a duty superior to every precept of personal freedom? It is unreasonable to oblige a man not to attempt the defense of his own life. And John Locke said, private persons have a right to defend themselves and recover by force what by unlawful force is taken from them. One may kill an aggressor where there is insufficient time to appeal to the law, for the law could not restore life to my dead carcass. I love that quote. You know what that quote? It's a fancy way of saying we don't dial 911. If you listen to what he's saying, Locke is saying, look, folks, there's some time that the attack happens so suddenly, it happens so swiftly and with such determination that if you can't defend yourself there, it's going to be too late to appeal to a magistrate afterward because you're going to be dead. That's how central self-defense is to our body of rights. And that's why I say it is one of those rights with which our Creator endowed us. It's part of our humanity.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Censorship is a key issue here, particularly for people on the right. Do you think it was addressed adequately?
Definitely not. It was useful to name check Diamond and Silk. It was useful to check even politicians who had campaign ads that were shut down. But in every case, Zuckerberg was allowed to essentially dismiss the case and move on.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is AWR Hawkins.
Now let's look at the practical level. There are two cities, you probably can think of them, there are two cities we can look at to really get a taste for the practical danger of gun control. And those would be Chicago and Baltimore. And there are some surprises in the numbers I'm going to share with you. Some surprises in them. But before I get to those two cities, I do want to offer an aside. I would like to point out a core problem with gun control. For those of you who are thinking people, and I would assume both the guests and the students here are thinking people, a core problem with gun control is that it rests on the belief that criminals who are currently disobeying every law imaginable will obey if we pass one more law. That's what it rests on. It is laughable. It's unbelievable. That is the premise on which gun control sits. Now, if any of you, and in here I just highly doubt it, but if any of you do entertain the thought that, well, you know, it's the way the left used to excuse the failure of communism in the Soviet Union, right? They say, well, they just didn't do this right or that right, and if they had done this right or that right, they would have survived. No, they failed because communism is a failing ideology to begin with. That's why they failed. And gun control, too, is an existential threat. It is a practical threat. It is a failing ideology at the start. There's no way to do it right. And we've done it for so long and so many laws. If any of you are entertaining the thought that maybe if we do just pass the right law, just stop right there, because it's not going to happen, and a criminal is never going to honor the law. Now, here's what will happen. This is what's important. Gun control upon gun control will be instituted if we take that path. And each gun control will make it incrementally harder for law-abiding citizens to get a gun for self-defense. And while that's happening, criminals have no problem getting guns. Understand this is a truth. It's a truth. Criminals will always have guns. I didn't ask you what you think about that because it's just true. So your worldview needs to include that truth. Criminals will always have guns. So when you pass gun control, it's not going to impact the criminal. Who does that leave for it to impact? Me and you and the mother, the single mom on Chicago's South Side, who tonight her only hope is 5 or 6 locks on her door and a baseball bat. And any criminal worth his weight in salt can kick that door in, and he's going to have a gun when he does. And shame on everyone here and everyone in D.C. and everyone anywhere whose solution to that problem would be make sure it's hard for her to get a gun. But that's what gun control does. That's why I say it's a practical threat, not just an existential one. Now I want to ask you a question. I am of a habit of when I make a point, I like to drive it home harder. Because I did teach in the university for a little while, and I figured out it was the only way for some kids to learn. And that's where I was. It's not here. But I want to ask you, if you happen to have a soft spot for gun control, name one gun control that could have stopped the Sandy Hook attacker. It's an open floor. Name one. See, you people are rational. You are, because you don't name one. See, the Democrats pushed all kinds of gun control after Sandy Hook. Now think about this. The Sandy Hook attacker stole his guns, so no point of sale gun control would affect him. No point of sale. Those guns had been legally purchased and registered by his mother. All gun control had been complied with. He stole those guns, then he killed her, which the news never reports. Then after he killed her, he took the guns to the school. He killed 26 people. Then what did he do? Killed himself. Now, if an attacker says to himself, I'm going to kill mom, then I'm going to go to school, kill some people, then I'm going to kill myself. Name a law you can pass to stop him. Any law you pass only inhibits my God-given right to self-defense. Any law you pass only inhibits the law-abiding's God-given right to self-defense. I just wanted to make that point. Because there are a lot of Democrats who couldn't wait to push gun control after Sandy Hook. Now let's return to Chicago and Baltimore. Chicago has long been an experiment in gun control. 1982 to 2010, they had a total ban on handguns. And what's that mean? That means the single mom on the south side was defenseless. The criminals had all the handguns they wanted. That's what that means. They currently have a gun violence tax, and they have artificial limits on the locations of gun stores so that there are only 5 gun stores in the cities. On top of this, state law mandates that would-be gun owners acquire a firearm owner's identification card before getting a gun. They have to go through universal background checks. They have to go through a 72-hour waiting period for all gun purchases. And they have to meet the minimum age requirement of 21 for a short gun or long gun. Now, on top of all that, Illinois was the last state in the union to enact concealed carry for self-defense, and they only did it then because the 7th Circuit forced them to. So in other words, they've done everything they could to be sure the majority of the people are disarmed. The majority of the people have trouble when it comes to self-defense. Now remember what I said in the first part. If gun control were in harmony with our founders' views, then I should be able to go to Chicago right now and find life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But what I do when I go to Chicago, if I look at the year 2012, there were 500 murders. And most of those were with handguns. In 2016, there were 760 murders. Most of them with handguns. Think about it, that's nearly 800 murders. They witnessed, this is how bad it is. They witnessed 644 murders between January 1 and December 24 of 2017, and they were cheering. I don't know if you remember, they were happy because it was 40 or something less than the year before. 644, and the whole year wasn't even over. See the practical cost of gun control? These numbers are easy to cite. 500, 760, 644. We get used to it. You look at a Memorial Day weekend in Chicago, 54 shot. You're used to it. You got to get unused to it. Those numbers represent lives. And I write every week on them. And you know what? Some weeks it's a kid riding his bicycle. Some weeks it's 2 girls playing 2 square or 4 square, whatever it is you call it. I'm not putting it down, but that's what they're playing. They're just playing their game on the street. They're the ones who die. Sometimes it's the kid riding home in the school bus. I've written where the mom drops off her boys for them to run into the store and get a snack. They both died before they made it to the front door of the store. These numbers are not just numbers, they're lives. And gun control takes those lives away. Baltimore. Baltimore is very similar to Chicago, but even worse. And I know some of you are going, well, how's that possible? It's not as big and different things. Let me explain. Maryland has gun control laws that are even more stringent than Illinois. They have Illinois' laws plus an assault weapons ban, a quote-unquote high-capacity magazine ban, and a requirement that if you're going to buy a handgun, you have to submit fingerprints to the state police as part of a registration scheme. You think about all that and you go, wow, that must be a safe city. I bet no one's planning a vacation to Baltimore this year. I'm just throwing that out. Baltimore in 2017 had a murder rate double that of Chicago. I'm going to say it again because you think I messed up. Baltimore in 2017 had a murder rate double that of Chicago. Their local news channel, WJZ, reported that in 2017, the number of murders in Baltimore were higher than the number in Philadelphia, although Philadelphia had over 2.5 times the population. The number of murders in Baltimore were higher than the number of murders in New York City, although New York City is 14 times larger. Gun control is a killer, folks. It's a killer. Let's think about this. The Borderline Bar and Grill in California about a week ago, not quite a week. 12 people killed, including an officer, killed by a former Marine armed with a handgun. The attack is going to motivate the incoming House to push gun control. We all know that. Representative Mike Thompson's already made it clear, and he's never met a gun control he didn't like. So it was a give me anyway for him, but they're going to push hard. All right? Now, I want you to understand, if any of their gun controls were to be enacted, it'll just mean more death. That's all it'll mean. And some of you may say, man, you kind of jumped to conclusions on that. What do you mean it's going to be more death? Let me explain why I say that. Let me read you the gun controls from California where that shooting occurred. This is just a few of them. Please don't think that this list is exhaustive. You'd walk out and leave if I had to read them all. The site of the shooting, the state of California, has universal background checks, gun registration requirements, red flag laws, a requirement that would-be gun purchasers obtain a certificate of safety from the state. It has a 10-day waiting period on gun purchases, an assault weapons ban, a minimum purchase age of 21, a one handgun a month ban, a ban on campus carry, a good cause requirement for concealed carry permit issuance, and controls on the purchase of ammunition, among other things. There's not a gun control that you've ever heard a federal level Democrat push that California doesn't have. And this guy walked right in and killed 12 people, no problem. And that's because they have another gun control. If you happen to get a concealed carry permit, they limit where you can carry so stringently that you can rarely keep a gun with you for self-defense. And guess what is limited? One of the limitations is any business that serves alcohol for on-site consumption. Let me say it again, Borderline Bar and Grill. When that guy walked in there, he knew no one could shoot back.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
I don't care if they call you sexist, racist, xenophobe. Just let them do it. Don't worry about them. You don't have to convert, don't have to convince. All you have to do is introduce the idea and trust people with it. You can trust that the conservatism is there. Progressives had to use it to sell their death ideology.
Sonny's Corner, Saturday at 1 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is AWR Hawkins.
Now, there are other examples I could give you. I could go to Great Britain. They share in our Western civilization for now. I could give you examples there. Great Britain began to push gun control right after World War I and incrementally tightened it until 1997. In 1997, they finally put in place a virtual ban of handgun ownership. So from 1920 to 1997, they worked. 77 years it took to finally virtually ban gun ownership in that country, particularly handguns. 12 years later, what's the Daily Mail report? You know, real quick, you know the Daily Mail. It's not exactly a conservative voice, right? 12 years later, the Daily Mail reported that Britain was the most violent country in Europe, quote unquote. They also reported that Britain's home figures showed, quote, the UK had a worse rate for all types of violence than the US and South Africa. Now, what happened to do that? There's only one explanation. Gun control regulations. That's it, folks. That's it. And now look at London today. Look at London today. Unarmed and therefore defenseless Londoners, they're being stabbed and hacked to death on the street. You ever thought about how close someone has to get to you to stab you? Now, I don't live in states that have a lot of gun control. I just never have, and that's by choice. I'm not criticizing people who do. But I live in states where if you try to get that close to somebody, they're going to put you in a sack and zip it up. That's how it works, because we have a right to defend our lives. In London, what are you going to do? Scream for help? Try to outrun him? This is the condition gun control has created. Think about this. In London this year, for the first time in 200 years, London had more murders in the month of February than New York City. Wow, that gun control is really working out. And again, I shouldn't even make a statement that makes light of it. These are lives being lost. These are lives being lost. People are dying in Chicago, in Baltimore, and in California, all of which are bulwarks for gun control. And they are dying in London too. Let me stress again that humanity in its essence, in our essence, desires to be free. And the exercise and defense of that freedom is a hallmark of Western civilization. I would assume you all know that almost more than any other student body in this country. In the United States specifically, we recognize that our freedom is a gift from our Creator, consisting of rights with which He endowed us. Just so important, keep that in mind. I know it's basic. But our rights are not sourced in a senator, a president, or a member of the House. They're sourced in the Creator. And when we consider Jefferson's emphasis on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, when we consider that emphasis, we must never do so, ever, without considering James Madison's emphasis on the right to keep and bear arms. And that is because our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are certainly and most efficiently protected by our individual right to bear arms. Oxford law professor William Blackstone observed this, that our natural rights exist in two categories, primary and auxiliary. The primary category would be those types of rights that Jefferson mentioned, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The auxiliary category would be that body of rights that defend the primary category. He put it this way, that one of the auxiliary rights was the right of having and using arms for self-preservation and defense. That's why I say, when you think of Jefferson's saying or words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, never do so without thinking of Madison's words, the right to keep and bear arms. The protection Second Amendment rights provide to our other God-given rights is not only an example of freedom's economy, but a testimony to the value of freedom itself and to the inestimable worth of human life. When the ability to use firearms for self-defense or for defense of life and liberty is artificially inhibited via gun control regulations, humanity loses. So when the left take their place in the House in January, when they seize on the cost of gun crime and use those dollar figures as a springboard to argue for more gun control, we got to stand our ground and point out that in reality it's the cost of gun control that's too high. Because it's the cost of gun control that's taking people from this planet. It's taking people from Chicago and Baltimore and Thousand Oaks, California and London, night after night after night. For in the end, gun control costs us our humanity and the dignity befitting those whose Creator intended them for freedom.
Hey, thanks for listening to Bullets with AWR Hawkins this week. Get your friends, your family members, your coworkers, get them to subscribe. It's free on iTunes. It'll download to the phone every Tuesday. You can listen to it during your commute or as you're doing whatever you do during your day. You can just listen to it and understand anew each week why the Second Amendment is so critical to our freedom. All right? Folks, until we're together again, always remember, more guns equal more freedom.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
I think that it's the epitome of hypocrisy. Unless you fall in line with their liberal agenda, this uniparty, globalist, liberal agenda, they will never support you. They use the whole gender issue, of course, as some kind of tool to prop up their messaging, but it's the phoniest thing.
Sirius XM Patriot, Channel 125.